There are institutional grants. That means like maybe a school will grant you money based on need or merit. All right. There's also need and merit-based grants. So need would be something that you qualify for based on how much or how little you make, okay, in a given calendar year. As well as the merit-based is what you're bringing to the table. Many times the first thing that merit-based grants and scholarships, they're kind of used synonymously, but they're slightly different, is usually your GPA. So your academics. That's usually the main starting place where most people qualify for grants. But it could also come from a test score. It could come potentially from your saxophone performance ability. Could be athletics. Like, so they use these two words. And really, when we talk about merit-based aid, grants and scholarships are usually the same because it's usually the merit. Grants tend to be more need-based. They usually use scholarship for merit-based. So like you're doing something to earn it. Okay. The difference is going to be usually the scholarships. You will get those from schools, but we tend to see kind of that word thrown around more from the outside organizations. So our local scholarships are a big organization that donate, I want to say it was like $800,000 to just our students last year, and it's only grown every single year. Since we've kind of put everything together in this nice package of a single application for all of our major local scholarships that comes out at the end of January. Okay, so that might be something to write down. It's not something that's available yet. At the end of the term, we will make sure students know about it, but we can't make them do it. Okay, so we will be annoying about it. You have to actually follow through, and I can all but guarantee if you fill out the application, you will probably get something. Okay, so it is well worth doing. But it is a process, just like all of the senior year stuff. Applications for college, application for financial aid, you're going to have to write. You're going to have to show what you know. You're going to have to do some recommendation letters, different things like that to qualify. But there's some big money to be had in that particular application, and that would fall underneath the scholarship. Okay, both of those are typically things that do not have to be repaid, meaning it is your money to use. They might come with stipulations, meaning a scholarship could be kind of earmarked for tuition only, okay, or it might be earmarked for books and fees, or it also might come with a couple like qualifying factors, like, hey, you must send a thank you letter annually and an update on your enrollment, or you must maintain this GPA, or some other things like that as well. Okay, so it's not just free do whatever you want money necessarily. Many times there are those qualifying factors. Work study is, it's not uncommon to see it, but it's not usually a large part of people's financial aid package. In terms of kind of like the overall costs and how much money is going where. But it's also not something to totally ignore. On the FAFSA, when you fill that out, we'll talk about that too. When you fill that out, it's going to ask you some information. Would you like to be considered for work study? Different things have different qualifying factors. Like some of it does have a need qualification to that work study program because most federal funding does in some way. But when you say, yes, I'd like to be considered, you are not signing up for a job. Okay, so I would encourage everybody to say yes. It will become part of your package, and you can choose any part of your package, believe it or not. Even our grants and scholarships are free money that we all want. There's an option to say no thank you to those. Okay, and that goes for any of these different options. Just because it's presented to you, you do not have to take it all. Okay, and so that's just an important thing when we look at the financial aid award letter a little bit. I'll show you kind of how it looks and what it really means. And then federal loans, the thing that necessarily people don't want, but I would say about 95% of people need. Okay, loans are really like just like a car. Most people do not go out and buy, or a house. Most people don't go out and pay cash for those things in most circumstances, especially with low interest rates or things like that. It's what makes education typically a reality for most families. Okay. And like I said earlier, it's more about being wise with how you're choosing to use those tools to access your education. And I think just like with most things in the world, mainstream media and society has kind of like cherry-picked a lot of the horrible examples of student loan crisis. And don't get me wrong, student loans would be great to avoid. And I do think there is a level of student loan issues in the United States. There's a ballooning concern and a continued concern about it. But I think a lot of times what we see in the news is actually something that the media has said, this person took out, if you're this person, sorry, but this person took out $300,000 in student loans for their history undergraduate degree. Okay. I'm sorry that I feel really horrible for that person, because that's a really large amount of debt to pay off for an undergraduate degree, especially in history. But it is something that if that happened in any other area, this person took out a loan to buy a house that are automatically underwater, and that person bought a Ferrari and they can't afford a Toyota. This person put all their eggs in one basket in the financial markets. We would say that person made a dumb financial decision. Right? And I think we victimize some of this a little bit too much, in that maybe they weren't educated enough, and that's okay. Like, that's what we're trying to do here. But I think it's also about being wise, and I think it does almost the opposite intention. It scares people away from student loans altogether. We want to minimize those, but I don't want you to be so scared of the idea of a loan that I have to pay back money. Your education generally will be one of the best investments that you'll make in your lifetime. It'll pay back more money over the course of your life than pretty much anything else that you'll probably do. Okay, so it's something that we want to keep that in mind as we're kind of working through some of this stuff. So there are some processes to get to the understanding of how my college fees are going to look. Okay, the first step in this process, well, the first step is also to apply to college, right? So that's kind of like a tangential process that's going alongside this. These are like two side-by-side things. But generally speaking, for financial aid, the number one thing that students will need to do, and this is a student-driven process that brings the parent in alongside that process. Okay, you parents and guardians, you do have a piece to play in this. You have a whole section just to yourself. Okay, and that section is probably the most influential section, but about 70% of the actual application should be student done. And here's why. Number one is it's mostly talking about them. Okay, it's not, when you're filling it out, it's not you're putting your parents' name, you're putting your name. It actually asks for your financial information first. Okay, and then you'll bring in, there's a parent section with a couple pages that it's going to ask for parent financial information. Okay, the other piece of why that's important is, and I'm going to say this several times, this is a multi-year process. Everything that we look at tonight is going to be done in some level every year that you're in college, including graduate school, including community college, including trade and technical schools. Okay, because when you go off to college or school of some type, you're going to do this in October of this year, I hope. But guess what happens within about 2 or 3 months when you start college in the fall? You're going to fill out this FAFSA form again. Okay, and then again the next fall, and then again the next fall. Okay, it does get a little bit easier after the first time. It saves a lot of stuff, and it's just updating numbers typically. But it's something that has to be part of that process to continue to get aid. Okay, there are 2 different applications that we have to be aware of, and it's not a both. It's an either-or situation. Okay, so this top one, they love acronyms in the world of college and financial aid, but it's called the CADA, the CADAA, or the California Dream Act application. This is the application that is for students. Students is the keyword. Students who are undocumented, meaning they are not a U.S. citizen. And what this does is the federal government still does not recognize students without status. Okay, so they can't fill out the FAFSA. California says we do, and so they created a separate one. It's very similar, asks very similar questions, which is why we tend to not even break it out, because it's almost a mirror image of each other. It just goes to different places. Okay, they will do that process in the same time frame, the same process, same deadlines, generally about the same required information, and that will grant students with undocumented status in-state tuition in California at the UC, CSU, community college level. It will grant access to the Pell Grant programs, okay, as well as a couple other California-based scholarship and funding sources. Okay, the only thing it doesn't let them do is get federally based funding. So they can't qualify for Pell Grants, federally backed loans. Okay, and so California has come up with some solutions for that. That will apply to some of our students here at North Tahoe High School. But I would say the vast majority of students that are going to be going through this process will complete the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. Okay, number one, a couple words in that acronym. Free is the most important one. Just like with anything that's good, someone decided we're going to try to rip people off and we're going to go put up a bunch of scam or phishing sites and things like that. Do not go to FAFSA.com. Do not go to FAFSA. Whatever else. It's FAFSA.ed.gov, and that should redirect you. Actually, I think that is actually now out of date. It's probably studentaid.gov/FAFSA. Okay. It needs to have that .gov is an important piece. Okay, so pay attention to that because you will put some pretty sensitive information in here. Okay, Social Security numbers, tax information, cell phone information, like pretty much anything that someone might need to steal your identity, you will put in this form. All right. So that's the application that will be needed to fill out by the student and the parent or guardian. And that opened on October 1st. That's the date that it will open every single year. Okay, and it's an annual process, like I said. And then there is a deadline to submit these. Okay, in California, the absolute drop dead deadline is June 30th. However, to qualify for significant aid, including things like the Pell Grant program, March 2nd is the California priority deadline, is what they would say. If you are applying out of state, you need to be aware that there are different deadlines by state. California is mainly the main one that I know that sets kind of a priority deadline of like March 2nd. Most other states, and our general suggestion is as soon as reasonably possible. Okay, there are pools of money that sometimes are finite, and as soon as they're allocated out, they might not have any more left. Okay, generally those are going to be pretty large pools of money. Okay, but if you wait too long, sometimes they might go away. So basically what California has done, and we're going to look at kind of how the FAFSA gives some information to them, but basically students will fill out either the FAFSA or the California DREAM Act. North Tahoe High School actually submits your GPA automatically for you. You probably got a notice, most likely in the things that you skipped through in the data confirmation, that was a whole bunch of PDFs that you're like, agree, just like everybody else does, like I did for my son too. That gave you the option to opt out of us sending your GPA. Generally, that was more important when we also had to send your social security number with it. We no longer go through that process, so it's literally just your name and your GPA that gets sent into a database that they will match with your FAFSA when it then gets there. Those two things are required to have access to this pretty significant Pell Grant program. And we'll break down the different levels of awards, but I mean, we're talking $12,000, $13,000 right off the bat for some schools. All right, so that's kind of the process of actually applying to some of these different things. Like I mentioned, October 1st is that magic date. We are now past that date, but that doesn't mean that you're behind. Okay, so like I said, it's my suggestion for timeline for doing this is, don't wait for waiting purposes, but it's not something that you have to like get down on October 2nd and submit this information and have it in. Okay, there's not like that level of rush. Okay, I say if you can aim to have it done by like Thanksgiving time, that's a pretty good target. Okay, if you are sooner in that process, that's just one less thing to have to worry about. But sometimes people have to get documents together or like need to sit down as a family and do this together. So just don't stress so much about the time frame as long as you kind of try to aim it towards the early to mid fall time. So here are a couple things that you will need to gather. If you are working on some of these things, and a lot of this you might already have. Okay, most people probably have a social security number. One note on that is, like I said, there's two applications, right? DREAM Act and FAFSA. DREAM Act is for students who are undocumented. However, if a student is documented, they will file the FAFSA. The difference is going to be if a parent or guardian is undocumented. Okay, and there's some fear and concern around that, and rightfully so. Okay, but the student will still file the FAFSA. However, that parent will not be able to create what's their ID. It's Fsa Id, the Federal Student Aid Identification, and they don't have a social security number typically. In that circumstance, that parent would use zeros as social security numbers. Do not make one up. They cross-check it against all these different things. Zeros is totally fine. And then there's a process at the end to sign it digitally with this ID that people will create. You will then sign that form and mail it in. Okay, so that's a little bit different. But generally speaking, for parents and students who are documented, this FSA ID is kind of the first phase, and everybody signing this form will need it. Okay, that would include a student. So the students need to go through and create this FSA ID, and a parent. Generally, you don't typically need two parents to sign it. One typically is fine. And it will ask for that social security number. And that's, everything on this process, just like we kind of recommend for college apps, everything through this process, you do want to make sure and double check that you're using accurate government identification issued names, government identification issued social security numbers, and cross-check those. Because if you make some mistakes, they're not assuming necessarily, just like in college apps, that, hey, there's a Sophia and a Sophie living at this address. They just think you're twins and your parents are kind of weird, right? They named you two different things that are very similar, right? So you do want to triple check that all this information is accurate, okay? Federal income statements, this is for both student and adults, okay? If you as a student made enough money to file taxes in that 2021 year, you do need to have those handy. So you might want to pull those up or dig through your files or try to find those online, okay? If you didn't make enough to file, you still will need to kind of guesstimate and still report income that you made, okay? It will also ask for information like how much is in your checking and savings account. Okay, so you just need to kind of know roughly what that is. And it's at a given time. Okay, generally those savings accounts don't make a huge amount of difference. They just need to know that. And then families, you also need to get these as well. Okay, yours is probably the most important ones. All right. Any W-2, sometimes if you're in a more unique or I guess less typical working situation, sometimes you have multiple jobs or maybe it's not a full-time job that you're getting. So sometimes you might need to combine these things in different ways. Records of untaxed tips, whatever it might be. All right. And then any bank or brokerage statements. And it will kind of spell out what exactly those are. So if you don't have them printed out, but many times they're already in your tax information. Okay. And they might not use all of those things. There are sheltered assets that are not part of this calculation. Okay, like your house, for example, is not part of this. Okay, but if you have a rental income, it typically is. For example, if you have a second home or a third home and you're renting it out, that will be counted towards this overall calculation. So this talks just briefly about the Fsa Id. It's all done online. Okay, so students, like I said, you do need this, and every student that I'm aware of here is a dependent student. Okay. As much as it would be great to just say, yes, you're independent and now you qualify for all this financial aid, you don't need my tax information, they don't make it that easy. Okay. It's actually a hard process to become an independent student for financial aid purposes. And that's different than just being independent based on kind of like you are now not underneath our household, like an emancipated minor. Typically an emancipated minor in some circumstances would still be qualified as a dependent. Okay. So you do need Fsa Id in both circumstances, and we're not going to cover the promissory note. That is down the road. So I'm going to sidestep a little bit and talk about another reason why this matters. So this year, AB 469, which is a California state bill, was passed, and what they said is the FAFSA and financial aid is very important. And so California said, we think it's important. And so now there's this new educational code, which means law, that every student in their senior year must complete a FAFSA or the California DREAM Act form or formally opt out. Okay, so this is a new graduation requirement. Okay, and so grand scheme of things, all it really means is we now have to collect either your confirmation that you did this opt-out form saying we're not doing this, between now and graduation day. So I'm imagining I'm probably going to have a whole stack of opt-out forms the day before graduation for people that don't remember to do this. Okay, it's new. It's a whole process. We're trying to figure some of this stuff out too, but that's ultimately what it's going to boil down to. I'm hoping the outcome is that more people would consider filing the FAFSA that maybe wouldn't in the past. It's totally optional. You do not have to file the FAFSA, but I would strongly encourage you. And people that sometimes would say, I'm not filing the FAFSA, could be in several different camps. It might be, we make too much money. We're not going to qualify for need-based aid. All right. Did you know that FAFSA is often used for merit-based awards as well? Okay, that $800,000 that a lot of our students get, no matter of aid, they need that on that application as well. So it's an important process for all types of aid. You very well might not qualify for need-based aid. Okay, but merit-based aid is also not something to kind of, not take seriously. Like, it can be significant amounts of money. especially at some of our private universities. So that's one group. Another group could be, like we said, those undocumented students. There's a significant level of fear around submitting information to a government who's probably shown themselves to be rather untrustworthy, right? And so I'm not in that boat, so I can't necessarily know what that feels like, but I can imagine. And I think the thing that I would say is it's hard to have that level of trust, but I will tell you from experience, these two, so financial aid and this department in the U.S. government has nothing to do nor talks with anything to do with the other side of the government, okay? And that takes a level of belief. Some people might not, and that might be a situation where someone decides not to file this form, okay? But that is the opt-out form, so we will continue to kind of get this out there. We're working on refining exactly what that process. We do have a form. We're going to tweak it a little bit, I think, just to refine our own process slightly. But we will get that out to you guys very quickly to the return. And as you complete your FAFSA, all it takes is a little printout. There's a page at the end that just shows that you did it. That's all we would need, and we just stick it in a file, say good job, hope you got a lot of money, okay? And you know, we hope that it helps increase access to financial aid that maybe wasn't there in the past. So the big question, how much money do I get? Comes down to kind of this rough equation, all right? And I'll tell you a little bit more about each of these. So the cost of attendance, COA, again, acronyms are all over the place. Cost of attendance, or COA, what that means, every school out there does an analysis every year and creates an average. That's an important word in this, an average cost of attendance for that particular coming school year. That'll usually account for tuition, room and board, books and other fees, and then generally a rather meager amount of living expenses. Okay? That will overall basically project how much a typical student might need to go to school there. The average comes into play in that, just like with everything, you know, the average cost of a Toyota Corolla is this much, right? There's different packages. It could be more, it could be less. Usually tuition, you're not going to really get a whole lot of play with. But room and board, you could, right? If you're like, hey, this is way expensive and I need a couple more $1,000 to make this actually feasible, look at different living situations. Sometimes they're averaging like a double room. There might be quad rooms available that lower your overall cost. Usually an average meal plan, for example, okay? They might have less meal plans. Maybe you don't eat that much. Maybe you eat a lot. Like you have those are all things that kind of come into play with the overall cost of attendance. Expected family contribution. So cost of attendance comes from the school. That's something that's available on their website. If you Google Cal Poly cost of attendance, you would find it. Okay, most schools out there will have it on their website. Expected family contribution, or EFC. That is why we file the FAFSA. Basically, we do all this work for that one number. Okay? That number gets sent over from the FAFSA to the schools. And that's what I think is sometimes a confusing part about this process is the FAFSA does not give you any money at all. All the FAFSA does is tell schools what you qualify for. The schools are the ones that actually determine how much money you're going to get offered, which is why you'll typically see a different offer come from each school that you apply to. Okay, so that's an important thing. They cannot do this equation without that EFC, though. Okay, so that's where we kind of get hung up. If we miss that X in that quadratic equation, it doesn't work. What that's going to do, so cost of attendance, I'm going to come over here. Sorry, people online. I'm not going to see this. Or probably here. Should be here. So cost of attendance. I'm going to do a rough, and hopefully my math works out. Example. Okay, so let's use a $30,000 cost of attendance. Maybe like a pricier CSU or mid-grade UC. In terms of usually the tuition is all the same as the cost of living there. So we'll say $30,000. It's a pretty average four-year college cost. So that's going to be whatever the number is, and annual. Yes, that's again. Thank you. That I said that earlier. I'm going to say it several times. Multiply this by 4 or 5. Okay, And just like with cars, just like with most things, this is sticker price, right? And this is why I always encourage people to apply broadly and diversely, right? We could make this a 7 instead of a 3, and it would still work the same. Usually the numbers down here tend to change as well. Okay? So what this would be, so $30,000, that's going to be the same for anybody, no matter what their background is. They can be a millionaire or have no money. That cost of them is the same. FAFSA is going to come back and say, hey, you know what? You make $60,000 a year, whatever, and they're going to come up with a number. This number goes anywhere from 0 to $99,999. Okay, and that's your expected family contribution. Essentially, think of that. This is what I probably will have to pay, kind of off the cuff. Like this is my base price. So we'll just use 5,000 for an example. Could be more, could be less. But BFC at 0 is such a thing. So what they do is they say, okay, that's going to mean my need is going to be $25,000. That doesn't mean that I have to pay $25,000. But what that school will now do is say, you know what? It's now our job to try to meet that need with the tools we have available. Okay? They will use grants, all those different 4 things up there, to try to meet that. So they might say a grant of $10,000. We'll do an academic scholarship of 5. We'll do work study of like 2. And then we'll say they'll package you with $6,000 in loans. Okay. That might be a financial aid package that they might offer you. So we add all that total up. So 17, what's that? 23, right? Math right? So, okay. 23K. So what that college would say is we got close. Okay, but what this does is 25 minus 23 means you have a 2K gap. That's the word that they would use. That's the leftover funds that their financial aid package did not meet from this. You also want to remember, like, typically they're going to need to add that in there. That we see this gap. Oh, 2K, that's not too bad. Then $5,000 from the FC. Still not horrible, but it's not as nice, right? And so that's typically one that many families might say, you know what, that's reasonable. We can like work in the summertime, we can fill this gap with different things, right? So, you're basically getting $17,000 of free money every year. And then you're going to be either paying out of pocket or taking out loans or a combination thereof of, what's that, $13,000 a year. Okay. This again is about average, I would say, across the board for most 4-year persons. So that's kind of what they do. Again, if you change this to like a 7 or an 8 or something like that, this doesn't change. This gap will be significantly higher, and you get a school that still offers you that. This gap goes from like 7,000 to like 37,000. That is where people start making kind of dumb decisions. I'm going to go to Chase Bank and take out a 20% loan that's not backed by the government, that starts accruing interest immediately, that has really strict repayment policies, and that's where we see that horror story happen. Okay. So this is where kind of that wise decision making happens, and that's why we want to apply broadly. Sometimes, believe it or not, private schools at that high sticker price, $78,000 a year. Sometimes they're at the same level or cheaper than a UC would be after all the aid is kind of factored in. Right? It's a very individualized process to understand what that looks like, but it's something that you only know if you apply. And if you rule those out just by sticker shock alone, you never get a chance to see. Right? Very well could end up not the right way, but I've seen it end up in both camps very easily. Right? So that's kind of what this calculation actually gets. So, like I said, the FAFSA does not award you any money. That comes from the schools themselves. The government, for lack of, well, they kind of do have infinite money, but they just seem to print it all the time anyways. So they should just print something like this now, but they don't, unfortunately. So they do limit amounts of money for grants and loans that they actually give out. Okay, and this is where people kind of get in a bind and they have to seek out other funds and funding sources. So, for example, a Pell Grant, that's one of their major need-based grant programs. Okay, that maxes out. I think this is from last year, so but it's fairly similar every year. Is about $6,100. Work study usually is approximately about $2,400 a year, and that's where you kind of sit in your dorm lounge and like take the mail and like probably sit on your phone half the time. Like it's a pretty easy job that like works around your schedule at school. My wife took that and she worked in the study abroad office, like in between two classes for like 45 minutes. Like it's like chunks of time. So it's a pretty cush job if you're kind of just needing a little bit to get by, okay, and kind of make it work. Loans are capped out typically by type of loan as well as year of college. Usually as you get older, they trust you with a little bit more money. It doesn't mean the cost is necessarily higher, but they just say like, we're not going to basically hand the freshman the credit card, and just let him go wild. And then there's something called a plus loan. We're not going to get into that. Hopefully, you may see that in your financial aid award offer. That is the one exception when I say who's signing the bottom line, the student. That's the one exception. The parent plus loan basically allows parents to take out loans on behalf of their students. Okay, and everything in this process minus that has no credit implication. Okay, so some people are like, I wouldn't qualify for a loan. My credit is crap. Like, it doesn't matter unless you're talking about that parent plus loan. Then the parent credit score does come into play. Okay.
Co-signer relationship.
Kind of, yeah. So state aid, so that's federal aid, that last page. That's what the feds give. And again, a lot of it is heavily need-based. State aid, which is a little bit of a combination of both merit and need. Okay, we'll break down what that means. But kind of this is what the rough outline, it's I think it's gone up slightly since this number, so it's maybe a couple $100 more. But when we talk about grants and scholarships, especially at this level, typically we are not talking about California handing you a $12,000 check every year. Okay? When you see that, think of this is a tuition discount. It's like a coupon. Okay? So they're basically offsetting your tuition and you don't get a bill for it. All right. And so you see varying levels, primarily because the UCs are more expensive than the CSUs, which are more expensive than the community college system and so on. Okay, so it's related to the overall cost at those individual schools. One thing you'll notice that private schools in California, many of them will qualify. So if you go to a private school in California, you might get all that aid from them. You can still actually qualify for a Pell Grant that will also apply in that circumstance. You cannot take these grants outside of California. Okay, so they are not transferable to another state. I don't think any of our kids have kids yet, so we'll skip that line. Not that I know of, at least. So a couple helpful hints in this process. A lot of times students have a very strict idea of where they're applying, which is fine. Create your list. We tell you to do that. We encourage you to do that. But again, I want you to apply broadly, apply diversely, and I would love for everyone to include a California school. Okay, preferably one that's also at different levels. I'm a firm believer that every single senior should look at and have a plan for a junior college path for a number of reasons. Number one, cost. Okay, we reverse shop in this whole process, meaning we make our list, we decide what we want Santa to give us, and then we have to go figure out how much it's going to actually cost us at the end of the process at the checkout line. Okay, sometimes that cost analysis didn't go quite the way we kind of expected, and sometimes those finances don't line up with our kind of outlets that we're going to, or schools that we got into. Okay, and it's a horrible feeling to have, both as a student and as a parent. Okay, kind of the stuff that you've been working on and working towards this, you bought the sweatshirt even and things like that, and for no fault of your own, the finance doesn't actually work out. Okay, and it does happen. Okay, and that's something it's a soul crusher, but it's also kind of that reality check of adult life. I would look great in a Ferrari. Even if I could work my butt off, I could save up, but even still, sometimes I can't afford it, right? And so sometimes that's part of that process of growing up, is understanding not everything is always going to work out necessarily how we envision it. And so that community college system provides another avenue in a cheaper way, typically, to actually still attain very similar types of goals. If you watched or attended the workshop for the seniors, I went over some UC statistics as well. If you did not attend, it's on YouTube. You can watch it. It's still good information. But that particular slide showed was the freshman admission statistics to the UC system and the transfer admission statistics to the UC system. So sometimes the barrier is admission, sometimes it's financial aid, sometimes it's a combination. Students who are like, for either of those things, admissions or financial aid, like, hey, I really wanted to go to this particular school or a school like this, but it was too hard, or my grades weren't quite right there, or I just didn't work out, or the finances weren't there. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily out of the picture. Okay, the transfer percentage, for example, for admissions, increased by about 15 to 30% between freshman admissions statistics and those students who were admitted as transfer students. So, Berkeley, for example, went from I want to say a 9 or 10% admissions rate to a 23% admissions rate, so almost double. Okay, and so students who are maybe disappointed in the process, there's still another way to get there, which saves you money, and there's nothing wrong with it going to junior college. I think some of my most favorite classes were actually at Cuesta College, and it was very interesting to see. But it's something that there is a stigma about junior college, but it is a false stigma. Okay, yeah.
Two questions. One is with the junior college path. Is there sufficient time to kind of generate that path after this whole cycle of acceptance and financial information results comes through? And the other question for you is, my daughter seems to be going the other way with all California applications. And I'm wondering if you would have the reverse advice, which is kind of what I've been nudging, which is don't shut the door on a world of opportunities outside of California.
Yeah, so I'll take those in order. So the time frame of junior college applications and things like that, there is. So it depends on the schools on the list. So some schools will get back to you sometimes as early as January, February. I would say in that circumstance, many students could get through and kind of do a good job of that research and enrollment process at a junior college. Many schools are not kind of until March or April. At that point, you start pushing it. It's not too late. Technically it's never too late at a junior college. The problem is going to be many times, for example, if that student was going to enroll at Sierra College, for example, that immediate fall after graduation, and they're trying to do this process in April or May, kind of after they've made some decisions and got financial aid packages and evaluated, that's when students are actually registering for classes. So you kind of just get bogged down in a couple other areas of the process, but it's not too late. It just might throw some inconvenient roadblocks along the way. Generally speaking, December, January, February is kind of the key time to really kind of start making steps happen with the junior college process. If that was a route that students were considering as their first option, or even students were kind of I'm applying to some really reach schools. I'm not quite sure how it's going to come together. I want another avenue, another path to help me reach my goals. And just like with all these other colleges, you can enroll in a junior college and just not go and go through some of that process just so that you're prepared if that does become the route you want to pursue. The other question was applying outside of the state. Yes, in some ways. I would say, generally speaking, you're probably going to be less fruitful with out-of-state public institutions. Just like with California, I don't know if you've looked at the news or anything like that, but you're a Michigan student and you want to come to UC Berkeley, guess how much it costs? It's $65,000 just for tuition. And so, the main reason is because they don't have the California taxpayer to help offset all these costs. And so very similarly, if we go to a Michigan public institution, they're not going to use their taxpayer money typically to offset their out-of-state non-tax-paying student to attend. But out-of-state private institutions, in-state and out-of-state really only applies to public. Private schools, it's pretty much one price. It doesn't matter where you're from. You can be international typically, and it's one price. And they kind of usually knock things down from there based on merit, based on need, things like that. So yes, I would say diversify, but the only I'll add one additional thing. So the only other thing would be California is a fairly expensive state. So a lot of California schools tend to be pricier. Okay, cost of living's higher, things like that. And you start looking all throughout Montana State, for example. Montana State, they're out of state WUI. So WUI is the Western Undergraduate Exchange. That might be something you want to jot down if you're considering out of state schools. Not every school offers that. WUE, Western Undergraduate Exchange. What that program does, that would be something to look up at each school that you're looking at out of state. But what they do is they basically split the in-state and out-of-state tuition in half for out-of-state students. And they do have some qualifying factors like GPA and stuff to meet some of those things. Some schools are wide open with it too. Like anybody that qualifies will get it. Some schools have limited numbers of these awards. But basically, at a WUI rate with Montana State, for example, you're looking at less than a UC with in-state tuition. Okay, and they typically do have some financial aid and things like that based on your merit and stuff. Where sometimes, so there's always that grain of salt. Kind of like I would say, typically out of state's going to be more expensive for most students. Okay, but there's going to be these exceptions. So you have to kind of I don't like I don't like limiting the list based on finances alone. Okay, it's about making that choice of kind of like applying broadly and then seeing kind of how it all falls together. As long as it's not all out of state or all private or things like that, you're going to get typically a myriad of options to kind of have that buffet of choice later on. Again, I mentioned kind of like I think everyone should apply for the FAFSA. Bill Gates should apply for the FAFSA, and he probably would. He's wise with his money. Like the dumb people don't apply for the free money, right? So I mean, they're rich because they wanted to keep their money wise, right? And so I would encourage everybody. It's not hard. The government already has your information, so it's not like they're getting any secrets from us or anything like that. This is kind of a no-brainer, but I'll reiterate it because I mentioned about college applications. But students should start using their personal emails throughout this process, especially with this process. Your school email disappears a year after you graduate, and guess how long you're doing this? Remember we talked about? Not for just 1 year. Okay, multiple years. So you want to start using all your personal emails for that process, preferably a professionally sounding one, like not something super cheesy or lame or offensive. And then try to apply earlier rather than later. We talked a little about the time frame. We're going to kind of gloss over a couple of these things. I'm going to kind of get to a couple of the other pieces. I'm going to just highlight a couple of the key points on each of these slides. MCS stands for Middle Class Scholarship. And actually, they just increased. I just read it this morning. They just increased this income threshold to, I think it's $201,000. So, believe it or not, that's middle class. So, this applies for students enrolled at a CSU or a UC. You do not need to do anything extra other than filing your FAFSA. So, there's no extra scholarship application for this. You can't have your second bachelor's degree going on. Income, we talked about that. Assets kind of are all combined. They have basically what this does. This will cover a portion of your tuition, roughly. Okay. Typically, it's about 40-50%, and there's a sliding scale. Typically, as you go up this income threshold, it'll cover a smaller and smaller portion of that tuition amount. Okay. So it will fill also any of that gap. That's a key piece that will fill some of that gap. They're going to use these other elements to fill in your first load there. This one, I'll mention just because I'm not sure if we have any foster youth that are listening or not, but foster youth do qualify for some different things called a Chaffee Grant, which qualifies for them for some extra funding based on their more challenging sometimes living situations, and they typically are also kind of what they would consider independent students typically. But just if you have any questions about that, feel free to ask. I mentioned the March 2nd deadline. Just like everything with the college application process, this is a deadline. This is not a suggestion. This is not we'll give you some extra days. Like you get it in by 11:59 p.m. Pacific time on March 2nd, or you no longer qualify for the Pell Grant. You just lost $12,000. Okay. And so it's an important thing. That's one reason why we say don't wait till the last minute, because sometimes there are some of these kind of like extra steps that we weren't anticipating. Hey, I ran into a glitch. Hey, I need to gather this document because it's asking me for this. There's some extra things that if you wait until March 1st, you might not have time to get it in by that deadline and get it submitted because you're missing a few things. So again, CSAC, the California Student Aid Commission, so the federal government studentaid.gov Css.gov. That's the main organization that processes this. California's version is CSAC, so you get some information and contacts from them. There are 3 Cal Grant tiers, A, B, and C. All right, and so we'll talk just a little bit about each of these. We don't, at my level, don't dive too much into all the ins and outs of the Cal Grants, other than kind of helping you evaluate a few of them. With Cal Grant, with that middle class scholarship, there's really nothing that you need to do to qualify for those, other than file your FAFSA, okay, and have some of these meeting qualifications that we'll go over. You do need to attend a Cal Grant eligible school. Like I said, all the state, public, and community colleges will be qualified. The private schools tend to be a little bit more hit and miss, but generally pretty safe. It's when you start getting into like some of the private/public colleges that are kind of like straddling this line. Like University of Phoenix would be kind of like one of those a couple years ago. Now they're kind of like delisted on federal aid and stuff like that. But kind of that situation, you get a little bit tricky. I would say most students go to places that would be pretty safe for Cal Grant in California.
All through FAFSA.
Yep. So all that process, FAFSA will send your information to, and the only thing that sometimes gets in the way, and I think there's even a slide on this, but is like if they can't match your name. So this is where like now is a really great time to go check Aries. And if Aries does not match your social security card or your birth certificate, you might want to contact Blanca and just make sure that those things match. Okay, because the information that we send has your GPA, which again, remember that equation was Cal Grant or Dream Act plus GPA equals, or FAFSA or Dream Act plus GPA equals Cal Grant. If one of those things is missing, they can't process your Cal Grant. And again, they don't make assumptions of who's who. They just assume there's 2 people with that same name. Okay. Cal Grant A is generally going to be your highest award. And like I said, these are kind of like, there's different levels of need and merit as both of these things. So this Cal Grant A does have a minimum GPA threshold. That's a 3.0, and that's going to typically use your A through G, very similar to your CSU and UC application GPA, where it throws out your 9th grade, considers your A through G only classes, doesn't use like PE and stuff. Very similar if you're looking at a transcript, it's like the middle bracket of the GPAs that we list. It does require, that probably is not totally accurate because you can use it at a community college, but basically what they do is they save it. If you go to a junior college and qualify for this, they don't actually apply this grant then. They will save that grant down the road for when you enroll in a CSU or UC or private institution. So that's what it's mentioned going on reserve. This is the maximum amount you can earn. And again, they might be different levels depending on your income, but generally they're more or less, you get all of this or nothing typically. You don't see very much fluctuation of that. Cal Grant B, this again, it kind of lowers down a little bit in terms of the minimum threshold, but also the overall amount of aid that you qualify for. So you need a 2.0 GPA on that same scale. And then you can apply these things to different levels, and it's going to basically cover. So this here kicks in kind of the second year of college if you meet the thresholds. So you kind of get a first year, I don't know, kick in the pants, little like bonus, I guess. And then they kick in some of this stuff and kind of work on the tuition with you. And again, this is some of the stuff that we don't really dive too much into because we don't work at the college, so we don't really do the financial aid office stuff. If you have questions on the kind of like how this all works, and it's important, right? So we mentioned this is a 4 or 5, depending on where you go, year process. After about year 1, it's beyond the scope of my really expertise. My job is to kind of hand you off to my colleagues at the college. That's where kind of that conversation, they have whole offices, the financial aid department or financial aid office. Many times, if you have questions about your offer, if you have questions about also years beyond, say, your freshman year, they're the perfect resource. And I would encourage, look on their website, find their phone number, and usually they're pretty helpful with answering some of these different things. C typically is mainly focused at the junior college level and or some of our CTE vocational focused programs out there. And that's going to cover about $1,000 of stuff. And then these are typically going to be like trade focused degrees here. So students who are applying for trade schools, UTI, different things like that, still fill out the FAFSA. There's still money that you can qualify for, both from the federal government and California and the school itself. So all the Cal Grants are all beneficial. Okay, just kind of a lot of it depends on what you qualify for. And ultimately, they're going to award you the best one that you can get. Okay, so if they can qualify you for the highest amount, they're going to do that. But then they kind of work down the tier and then give you the first award that's going to be the best solution for your own situation. Okay, so they're not trying to gyp you or rip you off or things like that. They really just want to give you what's appropriate for you. The other thing, we're going to circle back to this junior college kind of conversation and why I said that's usually a lot cheaper in the whole grand scheme of things, is they use different words, but generally they'll call it the Promise Program. In California, a couple years ago, they developed this Promise Program, which basically what it does is it waives all tuition fees. Okay, and so ultimately that's about roughly 14 grand. That's about what it is, 48 bucks a unit or 43 bucks a unit or something like that. It's for a full-time student. Okay, the goal is to get students in and out. That's their reasoning behind it. Instead of having people like linger and linger and linger and linger and never finish their program, because sometimes they're not motivated, but many times they have to work. So like people are choosing to take one class at a time and have a job because they need to, because they can't afford to not work or things like that. Hopefully this program, they're hoping, kind of helps at least speed up some of that process. Okay, so in that circumstance, many students are going to be on the hook for room and board, some books. Okay, and so kind of the design of community college is that they live at home. Sorry, parents, but that's kind of what most junior colleges are, and that's going to be your most cost-effective route to a degree. Okay, so that is at community college. There are some steps and requirements. So if you're looking at that, it's worth investigating in advance, because there might be some extra counseling, which is good to do, but there might be some requirements that need to be met, as well as like some annual requirements, like you need to have a counseling session every term or something like that to update your plan, or maintain a certain GPA and a unit threshold to qualify. So that's the Promise. We'll kind of skip over that. We kind of talked through that piece. We're going to skip ahead a little bit. Talked about the income ceilings already. It does. The only thing I'll mention on this one is it does depend on your family size. Okay, so we kind of use the different income ceilings. And this is again from 21-22. So there's probably a slight adjustment. If you Google the income ceiling, this is probably on their website. But you can see the family size and the different qualifying amounts based on the types of Cal Grants that you are having. And again, typically we are not talking about any of these numbers down here, but those are the most attractive numbers to look at typically. We're going to skip through this part because I want to this is going to be really hard to see. Apologize. I'll try to walk you through it. This is a sample of what a financial aid offer letter looks like. Okay. In this day and age, you typically don't actually get a letter in the mail. Usually it's through your student portal, but all the same rough information is usually on it. All right. And so typically what they're going to say is they'll have a cost of attendance. You can kind of see that at the very top. Some will just list it like that. Others will break it down. It's this much tuition, this much room and board, and so on and so forth. Okay. There's not a standardized letter yet. It's still being advocated for. We think it's important, but it's not there yet. It's getting a little bit better, but it's not there. And then this down here is really what the financial aid offer is being comprised of for this particular student. So we see it, cost of attendance at $56,000. This student, and you'll see it sometimes annually, more typically broken up by term. So like their own semester. So let's say a fall and a spring term. You might see it by tri or a quad if they're on a quarter system, for example. But many times they'll also show a total, so you can get the bigger picture. So the first line here, about $36,000 of a grant. Good, right? That's the good money. That's what we want to see. This $1,000 federal SEOG. Typically that G stands for grant. I don't even know what the SEO stands for. $5,900 of a Pell Grant. So far, so good. All free money so far. A Mass grant. This is in Massachusetts. That's probably a state grant that they have in that state. Okay, so again, free money. Federal work study. Now we're kind of getting to the point where we have to actually put some skin in the game. Okay, federal work study, $1,500. Again, it's not a ton, but usually you're not also working a ton. It can sometimes offset book fees for that year, something like that, to put in a couple of hours at the desk on a Saturday night or something. Okay, that's about $1,500, and then you get kind of like down to the bottom of the barrel, loans. You see two different types of loans. And you might see some other ones on there as well. Usually the ones we want to kind of start with, and I would say it generally starts with start at the top and take out what you need. If you need to keep going, take out subsidized loan means the government pays your interest while you're enrolled in school. And that's a pretty big incentive for a couple of reasons. Number one is this unsubsidized loan, when you take out $2,000, it starts accumulating that interest and compounding. Okay, so when you graduate, that's no longer going to be a $2,000 loan. Okay, where that $3,500 loan will still be $3,500 when you graduate, typically up to 6 months after you graduate and don't continue on to further education. Okay, so like that will continue to happen if you like stay at least half time, typically in like a graduate program or something like that. Okay, the other thing, which I can tell you from experience, that also helps your credit. Okay, many high school students don't have credit, or not very much of it. When the government is paying your interest, it gets reported to the credit bureaus. So that is a side benefit of a loan, especially a subsidized one. Okay, is you can start developing that credit record before you often maybe even need it to go get a car or an apartment or something like that. Okay, so subsidized, they cover that. Unsubsidized, they don't. So those are two key words. Again, you will typically want to take out the subsidized before you take out any unsubsidized amounts. On the right, you see check to accept. That's what I'm talking about. You can say yes, 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 no loan, no loan. If you can make that happen, and you take out all these things, but about $5,000. If you have $46,000, you get $46,000 in aid. If you have that $5,000 you want to pay out of pocket, more power to you. You don't have to take out a loan that year. Okay. You can also revise the total amount. If you're like, I want $3,500, but I only need $1,000, you write in $1,000. Okay, so it is what you need. It's not something. It's not an all or nothing situation. Okay, so that's an example of what you might see there. This is something that looks kind of similar, but it shows a different kind of scenario. A little bit lower cost of attendance. You see the costs broken down into the different areas. Okay, and I would say that's most common. They will usually show you that. More schools are starting to break out free money from not free money, which is also helpful in a confusing. That was a confusing one, right? Lots of acronyms. I'd have to Google some of that stuff to tell you what it actually was. I'm sure you would probably too, right? So this actually kind of spells it out a little bit more clearly. They also list like interest rates, so you can like identify information like, hey, you know what? I'm going to take this 4.45 instead of that 7.1. Okay, that's the parent one. That's the one that falls to you. Okay, and it kind of tells you also over the repayment term, here's what the total amount would be, including your interest and the original principal that you took out. I would say that is a less common approach, but a very helpful one, and what we would like to see more of. Okay.
Still coming from the university.
Everything is coming from the university. University. Once you file the FAFSA, those schools that you can list up to 10 when you submit. Students that have more than 10, what do you do? Any idea? Freak out, right? You're like, I better pick now. No, you list 10, you submit. Okay, this is the freaky out part because you're like, oh crap, what am I gonna do? I have to only list 10. You submit, it gets processed. You go back in, there's a little button that says add more schools. You can add 10 at a time. You submit the next set of schools, processes, you go back in, add another 10. Okay, you can add as many schools as you want. Okay, but you're not limited. But that is usually a stop and freak out moment for most students. So like, I have 20 schools I'm applying to. What do I do?
So the process again is you're going to get accepted in a school first before this sheet comes back to you.
Yes.
And so you might not see this information until how?
Usually it's a few weeks. Usually, some schools, if they're kind of on top of their game, every school is very different. Probably depends on the size. Yeah.
You might decide which school you want to go to based on this package.
Absolutely.
There might be a deadline to return your interest in that school sooner than you might see the FAFSA.
Usually, though, they will. So most schools will give you a FAFSA return or financial aid award letter before any type of deadline to submit your intent to register SIR. Okay. The only circumstance where that is not true is typically in early decision rounds. And that's one of the things that I mentioned in that other video I mentioned, is if you're applying early decision, what you're saying is, I am 100% yours, including my wallet if needed, right? And so when you offer that, they many times early decision rounds, if you get an acceptance, usually very quickly, if not with that acceptance, you'll get financial aid notification. Because what that means is if you get in, they're expecting you to withdraw all other applications that you might have in process, which is what you sign on the dotted line for, right? If we're talking like a gap of a few $1,000s, probably not going to get out of that one. If you talk about a gap of $40,000, there's probably a route out of that agreement. Okay, they're not going to put you in monumental debt to hold that spot. Okay, but you should not assume that is the answer. Okay, so you really want to kind of go through that process with early decision, in particular, with some level of care. But generally speaking, kind of going back, I think where you're headed is going to be the typical time frame. So like I said, most admissions results come back typically anywhere between January and like April, right? And so you might have a result that comes back in January with the financial aid result the first week of February, and you're like, sweet, this looks great. I still got 10 other schools to consider. And say that's UC Davis or UC Berkeley, who's always the last ones. And it's mid-April, right? You get your acceptance notice. You still have this one back here. Then you're waiting another week for that financial aid offer from Berkeley. And then you get basically 2 to 3 weeks to make a decision because they're going to want a deposit on May 1st. Okay, that's where kind of the stress comes into play. And that's out of your control. So you just have to kind of like, you got to turn it over to the college gods and say, you know what, have your way with me and I'll wait and do whatever you tell me, things like that. But yeah, it's a compressed time frame. And honestly, I think for families in general, including the student, that is actually a harder time of the year than now, believe it or not. Because you're actually right now, you're making some decisions, but it's pretty loosey-goosey decisions. It's like, I'm going to throw my name in the hat here, over there, over there, over there, over there, put all the work. Okay. When you get to April and May, you're making hard decisions about money and about where you're actually going, which is harder than now. Okay, so just know that is coming because that actually is more stressful. Not in the work sense, you're not doing extra work for it, more on the emotional sense of, oh man, now it's the scary time that I'm making all this stuff come to fruition.
And then you have to say no to things.
Yep. You have to do so wisely. You know, your first choice school might not be the first choice financial school. And that's why we always encourage, like, every school should be a first choice. You might have a hierarchy, I'd prefer here, but do not apply to a school just to apply to a school, to make someone happy, to like get in or things like that. Because you know what? Guess who's going to show up? Murphy. And Murphy's Law says you're going to get into that one school and nowhere else. And then you're in trouble. Okay. Yeah.
Well, so the follow-on question that you just said, when you submit to the 10 schools on that list, are you categorizing them 1 through 10?
Nope.
So they don't see a priority on your end?
Nope. They don't have time for that. They don't care. So I always just say, put it in alphabetical order. then you at least look logical. So that's another example of what that might look like. Let's move on. Let's see where we're at. So a little bit later on this year, probably closer to that March 2nd deadline, students might want to start registering for this. This just lets you track your Pell Grant award and also get notices of anything that's maybe an error. Sometimes it's a California state system, not foolproof. Sometimes we get notices, hey, this doesn't match. Other times we don't. Okay, and so you might want to, as a student, log on here and create this. We'll send out some reminders. Just know there's a portal to track Pell Grants. It gets more important when you start needing to actually decide where you're going, because you do need to update the school on this portal to make sure that Pell Grant gets applied at the right place. And that's an important thing. If you apply to a lot of different schools in California system, occasionally, they're hit or miss, but occasionally you won't see a Pell Grant. You'll see a Pell Grant on one and not on another one. Okay? And often what that means is you will qualify for that at any of these schools, but they're only applying it to one of your schools in that application pool because it's only going to count at one of those schools, and you're going to use it at the school you attend. But financial aid offices do kind of weird things sometimes. So sometimes if you like see it on one and not another one, generally don't freak out. I will probably advise you to make a phone call and just double check before you're making any final decisions that yes, we qualify. Yes, it will be applied as soon as we make this decision and change that school I'm attending on Pell Grant. You had a question?
Yeah, if you're applying for the 10 and you have, say, 8 of them as a 4-year school, would you also put a community college on them as well? So it doesn't matter. So it doesn't. They would, I don't have to give as much money to that.
Nope. So it's kind of like the UC application. They don't know where else you're applying. They get a copy of what's the ISIR report, which is a fancy term for your financial information and all this calculation and stuff. And it's not like you applied here and everywhere else. Let's see where other competition schools are going to or and things like that. Let's one up them and things like that. They don't care and they don't see it. I don't think so. Just list it all. List more than you think. So like this is where like, hey, I'm not sure if I'm applying to junior college. List the ones you think you could potentially in a remote world apply to. It doesn't hurt if you don't end up going there, which you will go to less of the schools that you put on there than you go to. They just get rid of it. Just kind of digitally disappears. All right, we're going to skip through these scenarios. I'm not going to give you a quiz. Talked about the name mismatching. So this is, again, where you want to double check the documentation. This is like nicknames. One thing I will note, and this is something that's still in flux, is students who are non-binary or transgender. This becomes a little bit of a tricky situation because they might be Jane at school and John at the government level, and we want to make sure that your information is matching up. And typically, unless a federal, or not a federal, but like a legal name change has happened, and like it's different on a social security card and birth certificate and things like that, students in that circumstance would need to use their legally recognized name, which can be horrible and a horrible experience for those students. And so I just want to make sure that that's known, but also just like prepare people as well. Like it's just a process that they will not match Jane with John. And that will throw a lot of issues into the mix. Some common issues sometimes. GPA you don't have to worry about. That's already been submitted actually, so that's done. Again, correct academic year. It's not this year. It's that first year that you will be attending school. So yours would be 23, 24. Okay. Filed the correct application, right? FAFSA, student is a U.S. citizen. California Dream Act, student is not a citizen. It is not both. It is either or. Was it on time? Did you meet the March 2nd deadline or your state's deadline or the final June 30th deadline? Did it get signed? Did you have to print a parent signature page? And that is sometimes a sticking point. When people wait, you have to put it in the mail. Mail takes up, this is for parents who are undocumented, you have to print a signature page. Mail takes time to be received, as does someone to read it and enter that information. Okay, so mailing that on March 1st will probably throw a few issues into your plan. Typically, it's postmark date, but it will delay the process rather significantly, like several weeks to a month or more. Twins sometimes have issues. I don't know if we have any twins this year. Any unresolved errors. When you submit, you're like, yes, submitted, awesome, I'm done. Sometimes you'll get emails, students, days, weeks later, saying, hey, there's an error. Then you go back in and fix this. You have to pay attention to that. Because what you have to do is go back in and fix that and submit it. And if you ignore it, it might not be fully processed based on that deadline that you submitted. Okay. So you usually use that submission deadline. Okay. But if you never go back and fix it, it might cause unintentional errors when you try to get financial aid down the road. All right, we're almost done. There is a website that has a ton of information for California in particular. But believe it or not, the FAFSA is, I was telling people, it's a complex, but it's not a very hard process. If you have all your documents together and kind of you created your Fsa Id already, hypothetically, it might take you 30 to 40 minutes to actually do it. It's really not difficult if you can follow directions. Okay, and the one thing, there's one step in that process that I will advise you to consider doing if you can. And it solves a number of problems and makes it up even faster, and that's what's called using the IRS data retrieval tool. There are very few circumstances where you can't. For example, like if a parent is undocumented, you cannot use this tool because they aren't generally registered with the IRS. But in many circumstances, you can. What that will do is a couple things. Number one is you'll basically go to the IRS website, you'll enter your information, and it will say, would you like to transfer your the right tax return, so you're looking at the right stuff, from the IRS to the FAFSA form directly. They will securely link together. It'll pull every single right piece of information from your tax return, so there's not like an extra zero in there. There's not like putting the wrong box in the wrong box. It just directly dumps it.
The adjusted income question off the tax return could be confusing.
Yep.
So it'll just pull
It pulls everything the right way. So it does that, saves time. You don't have to type any numbers in, very easy. The second thing it does is this whole process is what they would call self-reported. Meaning, I could type in any number that I want, right? I could. They will verify. So basically, the verification means a loose word for audit. Okay? They audit 1/3 of every applicant every year. So how many years do most people go to college? 4. Good chance you'll probably receive a verification notice at some point throughout college. Could be very simple, like, hey, we just need a PDF of your tax return. Cool, done and done. Could be more complicated. Hey, we need proof of your rental income. We need proof of all these other things that maybe like are more complicated to get your hands on or something like that. This process bypasses verification. Okay, so I would say that's even the better benefit because that verification process time takes more time than actually the FAFSA itself. Okay, so by doing that process, number one, you're guaranteed that it's right. Number two, you verify it yourself. Okay, by having it come from the source. All right, so that is part of the process. Very few people can't do it. So if you have trouble with it, please let me know. There are a few special circumstances that sometimes come up, and we know this. For example, divorced families. Okay, that happens. And typically there's levels of divorce and separation and things like that. So when we're talking about this, we're talking legally. Okay, so a separated family is not, they're typically still legally married, and that means that they will legally report both incomes, even if they're not necessarily living together. Okay. Legally divorced means that there is a legal document saying that we are no longer together, and in that circumstance, the student will use the family who either, this kind of goes in order, either has legal higher amount custody, so like 75-25 or something like that. Okay, they will default to whoever has the most legal custody of that student. If it's 50-50, which is a pretty common scenario too, they will utilize the place that the student lives the most. Okay, like it's usually not exactly 50-50 in most cases. There's usually like 3 days here, 4 days there, something like that. If it's literally 50-50, pick the parent who makes the least amount of money. That's the secret. Okay, but generally speaking, it's not, if you're 80-20, like you can't just use 20% because they make less money than you. Okay, that's not how it works. But so that's one of them. Another big one, especially in times like this and pandemic-y and recession-y and all this other stuff that's probably coming. Income adjustment, loss of income, more income. Okay, that's usually a big one, especially in resort areas like us where people's income sometimes fluctuates more than others. So you will list what's on your tax return. Don't bump it up, don't bump it down based on what now's income looks like. Okay, and that's a very common question because sometimes people are like, I don't make as much money as I did. My EFC is going to be giant, and it wouldn't be if we use this year's income processing. Okay, so number one is you do need to list as it's listed on your FAFSA. You will get into a bunch of issues if you don't. The solution or a solution path to that is once you get your financial aid offer letter, you will call the financial aid office. This is going to take some time, okay? But you will call the financial aid office and you will say, I need to request what's called professional judgment. And what that means is they will say, okay, so what are the circumstances that maybe we need to consider? And you'll say, well, I lost my job, or my job took a 40% pay cut, or whatever it might be. And they'll say, okay, tell us more about that. Do you have any documents that maybe support that? We might need a pay stub or things like that. And so what they'll say is they are the only people that can go in and edit your FAFSA, those financial aid officers. And so what they can do, they have the power to go in and say, okay, we looked at your pay stubs. We see that you're on track to make, $80,000 instead of $200,000, and we're going to adjust that on our end and adjust the calculation and reprocess your financial aid award letter. Okay, so that's called professional judgment, and that's basically for most of these things. A divorce recently happened, right? So that maybe you filed married to joint that year, and now you're divorced and you have different living situations or marital status, things like that. That's going to be something you would need to call in for. Hopefully not a death of a parent, but like stuff like that does happen. Different things that will change since that year that you filed taxes. They will consider those things. It can take some more time and energy on kind of everyone's part. And it can be a little frustrating just because college processes move slow. If you think sometimes high school processes move slow, just wait until you get to college. It's like a snail. But it is something that they will consider and usually works out in your favor. Okay. What doesn't work out in your favor is bartering. Okay. This is kind of there are differing opinions. I'm of the opinion of this is not like a negotiation. You're not going to pit Yale versus Harvard. Like they're not going to play that game with you. Okay. And so what they will listen to sometimes, if you're like, you know what, you're my first choice school, and we are so close to making it happen. We are $3,000 away from making this school a reality. Like, call them up and say that. It's not a what can you do to make me come here instead of over there. Like that will fall flat on your face, and that is not a good look for you. Okay, making the conversation that says you are my first choice opportunity, it's just not quite there. Is there any other programs I can qualify for? They will investigate. They might not make it happen, but they can investigate and look and see, depending on your circumstances, family situation, GPA, major, different things like that. They might have some additional funds they can potentially dig through that they didn't know you qualified for, like had in reserve or something like that, to make it a reality. Okay, I would not expect $20,000 to magically show up. We're talking usually one or two. Like it's a smaller amount. So like if you're in that gap situation with $2,000, it's sometimes maybe worth an ask. Okay, but if you're in the 30,000 gap, probably not going to happen. I will mention this. We've been talking about the FAFSA and the California DREAM Act. Those are kind of in this bucket over here. There is another application which 400 or 500 schools out there sometimes either will require or suggest, and it's called the Css Profile. This is an application through the College Board, the same group that does AP tests, SAT, things like that. So guess what it comes with? A fee. So ultimately, this is a separate application. So it's different than FAFSA and Cal DREAM Act. This is typically going to be probably going to your more selective institutions, your 15, 10, 5% acceptance rate schools, as well as your more expensive universities. Those high $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 sticker price, they need this information to really determine how much you need or don't need. Okay, and so what the difference is going to be is I usually use like the housing market as an example. So FAFSA is kind of your stereotypical realtor. Kind of like they get some basic information, they put some pictures online, they kind of know they do more than this, but they generally are not ripping up the carpets and stuff. The Css Profile is your home inspector. They're looking at the wiring, they're looking for mold, they're looking for termites, they're looking for everything. So it's a much more involved process. it is a much more in-depth process. They will consider custodial and non-custodial parents, okay, in those divorce situations, right? So like, it doesn't matter if you're 80-20, they'll look at 80 and 20, okay? They will look at primary income, primary house value. They'll look at a bunch of different things, okay? All that being said, it is more work. Sometimes this does come into need-aware admissions processes, so sometimes it has a much earlier time frame that you need to just be aware of. Usually because it's tied to some admissions processes. And so if you are applying, literally Google CSS Profile schools, the first link that will pop up will be a list of those schools that require it or need it in some way. Look at that list. Do you have any schools you're applying to on that list? If you do, pull information up on this, okay? Because it's something you want to kind of get started with sooner. This is a soonish, now-ish process. FAFSA is like, you can dilly-dally a little bit if you want. This one, don't. Okay? Because it will take longer, and you might need to dig up more information, and it might have an earlier deadline for submission. Okay? Yes?
Just to summarize, so I make sure I understand. These particular schools, their financial aid department has a more thorough financial audit and kind of evaluation process.
Yep.
So they're not going to just take the FAFSA, see that you were accepted or given a notice of acceptance, and then provide your letter. They're going to need a more thorough evaluation.
Yes. And so in many circumstances, I said all that scary stuff. In many circumstances, it's actually a good thing. Remember, those schools are very expensive.
Yeah.
So what they're trying to do is justify who really needs the most money. Like I said, that FAFSA EFC calculation is pretty basic. It gives a very basic look at the financial situation of your family. You can have very little actual income and a lot of money in a sheltered type of an account and qualify for all the aid, right? But this circumstance, you're like, no, you're not going to, like, you have the means to pay more than that. You're just not, maybe you're smart, but you're not willing to as well, right? Maybe you thought ahead, but I think that's good advice. But generally, they're going to say, no, we're considering a lot more when we're looking at this number. But generally speaking, it's a process, but usually one that ends up with most families actually getting more aid than actually having to pay. But it's just that kind of like that institutional justification process that they have to kind of go through to make sure that you qualify for it. So like this has a couple other lists on here. So, Claremont schools, USC, Stanford, many of those, again, private schools that usually have...
One UC school, are there others? UC, San Francisco?
I think that probably means,
universities?
USF.
Got it.
Yeah, I think that's a typo. Yeah, it's about $25 if you do qualify for fee waivers. Like for the SAT and stuff, you can actually there are fee waivers for submitting the CSS profile, and it is online only. This whole process is online only. There's no paper forms for any of this stuff. We're going to skip this. We kind of talked about some of those things. There's a couple scholarship websites that are available. I kind of went briefly over this in a couple other sessions in the past year or two, but generally speaking, most money that we have students earn is going to come from three primary areas. Number one, generally, is the governments with an S. Federal, state, governments. Okay, that's kind of bucket one. Bucket two is the school. Okay, so that's going to be institutional grants, offsetting tuition, things like that. So those are the two main, and I would say those are probably about 85% of where money comes from for most people. The third one is the family. Okay, so generally speaking, and I kind of teeter between, like, I want college to be free because that would be nice, but I also think that would make kind of college a little bit like high school. There is something to be said about having a little bit of skin in the game, right? And so I think affordable college is really the target that I would encourage and kind of advocate for based on what people can pay, okay? But we're not either of those real places yet, but that's kind of the three main buckets. The other area is this kind of nebulous scholarship area. And so normally students will get the most aid from that big single local scholarship application. That's going to be the best bang for your buck. If you are bored and have nothing better to do with your life, there are some sweepstakes you can apply for as well. And that's really how most of them kind of should be viewed. At this like FastWeb and scholarships.com level, there are going to be thousands and tens of thousands and even millions of people applying to some of these scholarships. And so you have to justify how much time and energy am I spending versus what are my chances of return on that investment. Okay? You might be better suited paying attention in class. You might be better suited sleeping. You might be better like doing other things that might have a longer and better return on your time. Okay? So you have to know that for yourself. I'm not saying don't apply for these things. If you're sitting around watching Netflix and twiddling your thumbs, sure, it could absolutely be somewhat useful. Maybe you might get something, you only get it if you put your name in the hat. But if you're sacrificing something else that's more important to do some of these things, it's usually not super wise. Okay? Local and regional area scholarships, which we generally promote and have access to here, are going to be your best bang for your buck. Okay. So that's kind of that piece, and we're almost done, I promise. Let me just kind of wrap up. I'm going to skip this. It's kind of, well, I won't because it's kind of a provocative headline. But can private scholarships hurt students? And that's the question, or the answer is also not totally 100% clear. So the reason why that's asked is because sometimes it might offset a different bucket of money that might be renewable. Okay, and so like colleges will always try to do what's best for the student. Okay, and so I like to say trust the colleagues at the college level to try to put your best interest at heart. They're not going to try to rip you off by getting these scholarship dollars. But if you get a scholarship, if you get a full ride scholarship and then get a tuition only scholarship from a community person, that's where you kind of get. That's kind of what it's talking about. If you don't have tuition and you have a tuition only scholarship, you might lose out on that dollar amount because you can't apply it to nothing. And you usually aren't going to use a check to go buy a car. Okay, so that's kind of that piece. Okay. If you have any questions about that, definitely talk to the college. We mentioned kind of the requirement about the new bill that's coming out, 2015 and 469 are the two bills that kind of talk about some of that stuff. But generally speaking, there are a few websites and resources. We shared a couple of those already. I'm going to give you 2 extra credit assignments if you want. The first link, and I will put this online and I'll put it in the email, a PDF of the slides when I send out the recording later on. So you can click on links and stuff. That's kind of a wonky link, but super extra credit because that is 150 pages long. But if you are one of those types of people that really wants to learn about student loans, that is the resource for you. It's the Wall Street Journal. They publish it. It's free and it's pretty up to date. But it's all about student loans. And it does talk about other attributes of the financial aid process and like award letters and things like that too. It's at least worth downloading so you have it handy. Okay, but it's pretty lengthy of a read. And then this organization, actually did a little bit of work with them. They are a private company, but they make a lot of resources available for free. So it's worthwhile checking out. And we have a number of resources also available on the counseling website at North Tahoe High School. One of the resources that's very helpful, especially at the end of the process, is something called the cost of attendance comparison spreadsheet. So what that is it basically has you type in one place. You can type in what is the cost of attendance, what is my free money offer, what is my loan offer, what is and it will total up. It'll total up. What's the 4-year cost of attendance? What's the 4-year total amount we're paying out of pocket? All in one place, so you can see them side by side, so you can get a better picture of like, this is what across the board our total expenses are going to be by college. So that's on the website as well, so you can download that. We're about 5 minutes over. Any questions that I can answer? I know it's kind of like a lot of information, so we got to process that. Maybe you don't know what questions to ask quite yet. But so if you do have questions, I'm happy to stick around for a little bit. If you have any questions for the group, we can answer that now too. But just a reminder, I do offer FAFSA is because of that bill, it's a pretty important thing for us this year in particular and kind of moving forward. So we're going to spend some extra time trying to help with some of those things. The hard part is it's a very family-oriented process. So I can't do anything on behalf of you, right? So like it kind of takes you stepping out and saying, I need help with this or something like that. And I'm happy to do that. I do have an and I sent it out. I'll probably resend it out with this email and follow up. But I have some set aside RTI time, so that's in the morning time frame, just for financial aid workshops. I also have college application workshops, which is more for students. But the financial aid one is open for students or families. The only thing you have to come and check in with the office. Just that we're in the ceramics room on that morning. It's about an hour that I'm happy. It's just drop in, just stop by.
Okay.
If we have questions, could be a 5-minute question, could be an hour-long question. I'll be in there the whole time. We can kind of help with some of those different things.
That sounds interesting to me. I've gone in. My daughter has set up her student FAFSA form. I've done mine. There's just observation, I think, about functionality and how are they really talking. And then I got a dashboard that made a notification that there were some dollars available, but then I went back in there and it was gone, and it may still be approving, but I think having 10 minutes of your time with my daughter and I, with her portal up and me, I think you could probably bring us together pretty quick.
Yeah.
So when did the RTI that you'll
so it's 7:30 to 8:30.
Yep.
That's those Wednesdays and Thursdays typically.
Okay.
And then I do have some specific dates, so I will send that out probably tomorrow morning when I post this stuff. I'll send out an email and I'll include the dates that are specific for financial aid. And again, if those dates don't work, that's a particular date and time, and I'm sure you work like I do. I'm happy to sit down. There's other ways you make an appointment online. We can sit down. I'm happy to do that too. And sometimes it is important to kind of come in with your student and a computer. Like a lot of times when someone tries to explain something like I'm not totally following, if I can see it, kind of walk through what you're having trouble with, that's where I can kind of help troubleshoot some steps or connect you to the right help person at the
So
FAFSA.
this is getting into the minutia, but I'm using the security verification via text, which I don't get text while I'm on campus.
Yep.
So I'm assuming there's some way we can figure out how to override that or use another security process.
Yeah, as long as you verified, that was an issue I was running in, and you guys had mentioned you had. So there has been some issues with some of their verification, and I think that's an internal piece on their end. It's not so much on our end. I was working with a student today that was having trouble.
I mean, I could log in down the street and then come into the office quickly once I'm on the portal, but then whatever.
And sometimes you can actually do it on an email as well. So if you haven't verified your email, they also will send that as well. And that's usually the
parents can get on the Wi-Fi here because I've never actually.
Yep. There's a public Wi-Fi here, so you can access all those things. Good questions. Any other questions for the whole group? Otherwise,
It's like telling me I don't have an account, but when I try to make an account, it says
tells you have an account.
yeah. Is that like probably my end?
Probably yours. Not typically at your fault. And so there's a number of things that it could be. Like that would be something like, come in and show me and we can kind of take a look. Sometimes it's incorrect email. Sometimes mom or someone made an account for you and didn't tell you, things like that. So, I mean, all those types of things all can happen.
It's always mom's fault.
Right? And so those are all things that could happen. Sometimes it's, caps locks is on. So it's kind of your standard account troubleshooting process to start. But then kind of like the same thing happens in the college world all the time. We get to a certain point, we don't have any access to fix anything on our end, so then it's kind of like, all right, now we got to connect with the support people at FAFSA. So the good news is they're very good. I would encourage, if you have trouble, use the chat function. The chat function is very quick and very easy to get a hold of someone. I think it even has extended hours, and it's not like your normal tech support chat where you have to answer every question like a million times. Like they're really pretty good at helping. So that's my first place. If you're like stuck and it's after hours, or like we've troubleshooted as best we can, usually I'll hop on the chat and be like, I'm trying to help the student. What would I do? And they're quick and on it. Cool. Well, thank you guys all for coming. I appreciate it. Lots of information, lots of stuff to think about. If you have other questions, feel free to stop by. I'll hang out up here. If you have any questions that you want to talk about individually, let me stop this so we're not recording all of our fun conversations.